A boy finds a baby in the trash and immediately takes it to the hospital. The doctor is horrified when he realizes that the cold October wind cut through the narrow streets of Ashbury, a small town in the north of England, with a biting sharpness that made Ethan James bury his face deeper into the collar of his coat. His backpack jostled with every hurried step as he walked down the familiar route toward school, his breath visible in the chilly morning air. The shortcut through the alley saved him a good 10 minutes on his journey, something he appreciated more now that the weather was getting colder. It was the kind of day where everyone wanted to stay inside. Ethan had taken this route dozens of times without incident. The alley was mostly deserted except for a few scattered trash bins and piles of leaves that had gathered in corners. He had never found it threatening. It was just a quick pass between two streets, a quiet little detour in an otherwise routine morning. Today, though, something felt different. As he approached the middle of the alley, the familiar sounds of the town, distant traffic, the occasional chatter of early morning commuters, faded, leaving an unsettling quiet in their place. It wasn't the silence itself that disturbed him, but something he couldn't quite name. A feeling. The kind that creeps up on you when something isn't right. Then he heard it. A sound so faint it barely registered at first. He stopped in his tracks and straining to listen. Was it the wind? No, it was something else. A weak, stuttering cry, like a small, desperate voice lost in the noise of the world. He looked around, confused, scanning the alley for the source. The cry came again, this time clearer. It was unmistakable now. A baby. Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound sent a chill through his body, colder than the October air. He wasn't imagining it. Someone had left a baby out here, in the trash, in the cold. For a brief moment, his legs locked in place. His mind raced, trying to process what he was hearing, what he was supposed to do. His body told him to move on, but something else, a deep, gnawing fear, kept him rooted to the spot. He wasn't the type to get involved. His dad had always told him to keep his head down, mind his business, and stay out of trouble. The world was a complicated place, full of problems bigger than a 12-year-old could handle. And this was one of those problems. A newborn baby, abandoned and alone in a filthy alley. That wasn't something he knew how to deal with. His first instinct was to turn around, to pretend he hadn't heard anything, and walk away. Someone else would find the baby. Someone more equipped to handle this. Someone older, wiser, more responsible. Maybe a passerby. Maybe someone living nearby who heard the same cries he did. It wasn't his responsibility. What could he do anyway? But as soon as the thought entered his mind, guilt followed. What if no one else heard the cries? What if no one else was around? The baby's soft, desperate sounds seemed to grow louder in his mind, filling the alley. What if it was dying? Right there in front of him, and he just walked away. He glanced back toward the end of the alley, where the street opened up to the main road. If he kept walking, no one would know. He could go on with his day, get to school, and never think about it again. But then the image of that helpless baby flashed in his mind. Tiny, fragile, alone. If he didn't act, who would? Ethan's heart pounded harder as he realized he was at a crossroads. He could either ignore it and hope someone else would come, or he could push past his fear and do something. What if it was too late by the time someone else found the baby? He felt his stomach twist. He had to at least look. His legs trembled as he took a hesitant step toward the sound. Then another, inching closer to the pile of trash where the faint cries seemed to come from. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave this nightmare behind, but his feet kept moving. The smell of rotting garbage hit him as he neared the trash bags piled against the alley wall. It was overwhelming, thick and putrid, and it made him want to gag. He paused, taking a deep breath to steady himself. His hands shook as he reached out to shift one of the bags aside, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. And then beneath the tattered remains of an old blanket, he saw it. A baby. A newborn. Tiny and pale. Swaddled in a filthy, torn piece of cloth. Its skin was so light it was almost blue, and its eyes were half closed, too weak to even cry properly. The little whimpers that had stopped Ethan in his tracks had faded into nothing more than shallow breaths. The baby wasn't moving much, its body limp and cold. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His entire body went numb as he stared down at the infant. For a few moments, everything else disappeared, the alley, the noise, even the cold air. There was just him and this fragile, abandoned life lying there in the trash. His mind blanked, overwhelmed by the horror of what he was seeing. This can't be real, he thought. Who would leave a baby here? His hands hovered above the baby, unsure of what to do. Should he pick it up? Should he call for help? His fingers shook as he crouched closer, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. This baby was going to die if he didn't do something. Right here, right now. But fear gripped him. What if he hurt the baby by moving it? What if it was already too late? 1,000 panicked thoughts raced through his head, each one more terrifying than the last. He wasn't equipped for this. He wasn't a doctor. He didn't know how to handle a newborn. But leaving it there, cold and alone in a pile of trash, felt even worse. If I don't act now, no one will, he thought again. This time with a sense of finality that settled deep in his chest. His movements became automatic, driven by an instinct he didn't fully understand. Carefully, he reached down and lifted the baby from the ground. The infant barely stirred, its tiny body almost weightless in his arms. It was cold, so cold it made Ethan's skin crawl with fear. He wrapped the blanket tighter around the baby, hoping to shield it from the biting wind. Ethan stood, the baby cradled against his chest, and started walking, slowly at first, then faster as adrenaline took over. The hospital was only a few blocks away, and he knew he had to get there fast. His legs felt like lead-eye, but his heart raced with urgency. He didn't know if the baby would make it, but he had to try. As he ran down the street, his mind whirled with questions he couldn't answer. What would the doctors say when he showed up with a baby he found in the trash? Would they think he was lying? Would they even be able to save it? But none of that mattered right now. The only thing that mattered was getting the baby to safety. The automatic doors of Ashbury General Hospital whooshed open as Ethan burst inside, the cold morning air clinging to his clothes as he stumbled into the warmth. His chest burned from the cold air he had inhaled during his frantic run, and his legs felt like jelly. Still, he clutched the tiny, limp form in his arms, feeling its frail weight and the soft, shallow breaths against his chest. A whirlwind of panic, fear, and something else, something urgent and raw, surged inside him. For a split second, the sight of the hospital lobby was overwhelming. It was brighter than he expected, the white fluorescent lights reflecting off shiny floors and sterile walls. People moved around him, patients, nurses, hospital staff, but none of them seemed to notice him at first, not until he shouted, "Help! Please!" His voice cracked, catching the attention of a nurse at the reception desk. "It's a baby, I found a baby." The nurse's head snapped up, her expression shifting from casual distraction to alarm. Her wide eyes locked onto the bundle in Ethan's arm, and she was out of her chair in an instant, moving quickly toward him. The seconds that passed felt endless, and Ethan's grip on the baby tightened instinctively as the nurse reached him. Her hand hovered over the baby, her face filled with a mix of concern and disbelief. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she took in the sight of the newborn, wrapped in the filthy, torn blanket. "What happened? Where did you find it?" Ethan's throat was dry, his mouth moving but no words coming out. All he could do was gesture helplessly toward the door, the image of the alley still fresh in his mind. He wanted to explain, to tell her everything, but the sight of the baby lying there in the trash, so fragile and cold, had scrambled his thoughts. "Come with me," the nurse said urgently, snapping into action. She signaled to another nurse at the far end of the room, who rushed over with a gurney. "We need to get this baby to the ER right away." In a blur, the second nurse appeared, her face stern with focus. The gurney was wheeled closer, and before Ethan knew it, the baby was lifted from his arms. For a brief moment, he hesitated, his hand still reaching out for the small form as it was placed on the gurney. The nurses worked with practiced precision, already checking the baby's pulse and breathing, shouting medical terms Ethan didn't understand. It was like watching a scene from a movie unfold before him, unreal and terrifying. He couldn't move, rooted to the spot as the nurses rushed the baby down a hallway and through a set of swinging doors, disappearing from view. The small cries that had pierced the quiet of the alley had faded into eerie silence, leaving Ethan standing there, his heart pounding so loudly in his chest that it echoed in his ears. Someone touched his arm, pulling him from the daze. It was the first nurse, her voice softer now, though still urgent. "Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes scanning his face. "Are you hurt?" Ethan shook his head, the words finally forming. "No, I found the baby in an alley, behind the shops." The nurse's eyes widened and her face paled slightly. She knelt down to his level, her voice careful and calm. "You found the baby just now?" How long has it been out there? I don't know, Ethan replied, his voice trembling. It was just there, lying in the trash. I heard it crying and... He swallowed hard, trying to push back the knot that was rising in his throat. I didn't know what to do. You did the right thing by bringing the baby here, she said, squeezing his arm gently. That was very brave. We'll take care of everything now, all right? Brave. That word echoed in his mind, though it felt hollow. Was it brave, what he had done? Or was it just what anyone would have done? The thought of leaving the baby there, of turning away and pretending he hadn't heard anything, had crossed his mind for just a split second back in that alley. And that thought made him feel ashamed now, even if he had pushed it aside and acted. But he had acted. He was here. And now it was out of his hands. The nurse guided him to a nearby bench, sitting him down carefully as if he were the one who needed medical attention. I'll get you some water, okay? Just sit tight. You've had a big shock. Ethan nodded, though his body felt numb, his mind still racing through the events of the last half hour. It had all happened so fast, but now, in the sterile calm of the hospital, the weight of it hit him. His hands were trembling slightly, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving him shaky and cold. He could still feel the baby's frail weight in his arms, the tiny body so still and cold that it made his chest tighten with fear. Is the baby going to be okay? The question lingered in his mind, heavy and unanswerable. The nurse returned with a small plastic cup of water, pressing it into his hand with a reassuring smile. Here, drink this. You're going to be all right. Ethan took a sip, though the water did little to soothe the dryness in his throat. He glanced toward the swinging doors where the baby had disappeared, his heart still thudding painfully in his chest. What's going to happen to the baby? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The nurse sighed softly, her expression shifting to something more somber. The doctors are working on stabilizing the baby now. It was in a bad state when you brought it in, but you got here just in time. That might have saved its life. Ethan stared at her, the enormity of what she was saying sinking in. He had saved a life. That thought alone felt surreal, like something that happened in movies or stories, not in real life, not to him. But it didn't feel like a victory. The image of the baby's pale, weak body kept flashing in his mind, and all he could think about was how fragile it had been. How close to death. Just in time, he repeated, the words hollow on his lips. The nurse gave him a sympathetic look, patting his shoulder lightly. The doctors will do everything they can, okay? You've done more than enough. The baby's safe now. But Ethan wasn't sure that was true. The baby might be in the hands of doctors, but safe felt like a word that didn't belong here. Not when the baby had been abandoned in the trash, left to die. And what would happen next? What if the baby didn't make it? What if? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. A man in a white coat, his hair graying at the temples and his face etched with lines of exhaustion, stopped in front of him. His hospital ID badge read, Dr. Harper, and he gave Ethan a small, tired smile. Hi there, Dr. Harper said, his voice calm but firm. I'm Dr. Harper. You're the one who brought the baby in, right? Ethan nodded, gripping the cup of water tightly in his hands. First off, I want to tell you that what you did was incredible, Dr. Harper continued, kneeling down slightly to meet Ethan's gaze. You acted quickly, and that might have saved the baby's life. You should be very proud of yourself. Proud. Another word that felt out of place, heavy with responsibility. Ethan didn't feel proud. He felt scared, worried, unsure of what was going to happen next. But he nodded again, his throat too tight to speak. The baby's in critical condition right now, Dr. Harper went on, his tone more serious. It was severely malnourished and dehydrated when you brought it in. We're doing everything we can to stabilize it, but it's going to take some time. Right now, we're monitoring its breathing and giving it fluids. Ethan's heart sank. He had hoped for a clearer answer, something more certain. Is it going to be okay? Dr. Harper sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. We're hopeful, but it's too early to say for sure. The baby's condition is very fragile, and it was exposed to the cold for a long time. We're doing everything we can, but right now we just have to wait and see. The pit in Ethan's stomach deepened. Wait and see. It sounded like a long, endless stretch of uncertainty, the kind that gnawed at you from the inside. What happens now? Ethan asked, his voice small, almost afraid of the answer. Well, Dr. Harper said, standing up and folding his arms across his chest. "After we stabilize the baby, we'll have to notify the authorities. There'll be an investigation. We need to find out who left the baby there and why. It's important that we get to the bottom of this so that the baby can be placed in a safe environment." "The authorities," Ethan repeated, feeling a jolt of unease. Dr. Harper nodded. "Yes, the police will need to be involved. In cases like this, when a baby is abandoned, it's considered a criminal matter. But more than that, we need to understand what led to this. Sometimes people abandon children out of desperation, or because they feel they have no other choice. It's tragic, but it happens." Ethan looked down at his hands, his mind whirling with thoughts he couldn't untangle. The idea of police getting involved made everything feel heavier, more real. He had found the baby, but now it would become a case, an investigation. People would be asking questions that might not have easy answers. "What happens to the baby after?" he asked quietly. If it gets better." Dr. Harper hesitated for a moment, his eyes softening. "If the baby pulls through, it will likely be placed into the care of social services. From there, they'll assess the situation and determine whether the baby can be placed with a family or if it will need to go into foster care. But that's a long process. Right now, we're just focused on making sure the baby survives." Ethan swallowed hard, the knot in his throat tightening. The thought of the baby being passed from one system to another, without a family, without anyone to care for it, made his chest ache. It wasn't fair. No baby should have to go through that, especially not one that had already been abandoned once. He wanted to ask more, but the words stuck in his throat. What about the baby's mother? What would happen to her, and why had she left her child like that? Ethan couldn't shake the image of the baby in the trash, discarded like it didn't matter. But the more he thought about it, the more he wondered if there was more to the story. If the mother had been scared, or desperate, or alone. "We'll let you know if there are any updates, Wang," Dr. Harper said, giving him another reassuring smile before turning to leave. "For now, try to rest. You've done a lot today." As the doctor walked away, Ethan felt the weight of the situation settle more heavily on his shoulders. He had done everything he could, but somehow, it didn't feel like enough. The baby was still fighting for its life, and there were so many unknowns, so many things that could still go wrong. He leaned back in the chair, his head resting against the wall as he stared up at the ceiling. His mind was buzzing with too many thoughts to sort through, each one more confusing than the last. All he knew was that he couldn't just walk away now. He couldn't just forget what had happened, couldn't go back to his normal life and pretend that this morning hadn't changed everything. The baby's fate wasn't in his hands anymore, but that didn't stop him from caring. It didn't stop the feeling deep inside him that he had to see this through, whatever that meant. Even if it meant waiting in this hospital for hours, days, however long it took. He wasn't ready to let go, not yet. The fluorescent lights of Ashbury General Hospital flickered slightly as Ethan sat in the small waiting room, his legs bouncing nervously. The thin plastic chair felt too small, too stiff beneath him, but he hadn't moved since Dr. Harper had given him the initial update. He kept his eyes fixed on the double doors leading to the emergency room, hoping with every fiber of his being that the next person to come out would have good news. The minutes felt like hours, and the air was heavy with the kind of silence that made everything worse. Nurses passed by in quick motions, their footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet hallway, but none of them spared a glance at the boy sitting so still, lost in thought. Ethan couldn't stop replaying the moment he had found the baby in his mind. The faint, heartbreaking cry cutting through the alley, the pile of garbage, the tiny form wrapped in a filthy, torn blanket. His stomach twisted at the thought. The baby had been so small, so fragile, and yet whoever had left it there hadn't thought twice. Who could do something like that? He wondered for what felt like the 100th time. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the image from his mind. He didn't know how long he had been sitting there when a figure finally appeared in his peripheral vision. His heart leapt, hoping it was someone coming to tell him that the baby was okay, but it was just Dr. Harper again. The man looked more tired than the last time Ethan had seen him. Dark circles under his eyes and a weary expression etched onto his face. He approached Ethan slowly, his steps cautious as if he were preparing for a difficult conversation. "Ethan," Dr. Harper said softly, his voice a little hoarse. "We need to talk for a moment." Ethan's heart sank. The tone in the doctor's voice wasn't one that carried good news. He had heard that tone before, when the doctor had explained that his mother wasn't coming home from the hospital after her long illness. That same sense of dread crawled up his spine now, settling in his chest. Without saying a word, Ethan stood up, his legs shaking slightly as he followed Dr. Harper down the hall. The doctor led him to a small consultation room, a sterile, impersonal space with pale blue walls and uncomfortable chairs. There was a large window that overlooked the hospital parking lot, the view showing nothing but rows of cars and a gray, overcast sky. The room was eerily quiet except for the faint hum of machinery in the distance. Ethan sat down stiffly, barely aware of his movements, his mind spinning with the possibilities of what Dr. Harper was about to say. The doctor took a seat across from him, exhaling slowly before beginning. "The baby is stable for now," he started, his eyes flicking over to Ethan as if gauging his reaction. "But the situation is still very serious. The infant was severely malnourished and dehydrated when you brought it in. It's going to take time for the baby's body to recover from that kind of neglect." Ethan swallowed hard, the knot in his throat making it difficult to speak. "So, the baby's going to be okay?" Dr. Harper paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "We're hopeful," he said carefully, his voice tinged with caution. "But it's still too early to tell for sure. The baby's condition was critical when you found it, and there are still complications we're keeping an eye on." "What kind of complications?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor leaned forward, his tone growing more serious. "There are signs of physical trauma," he explained. "The baby has bruising on its arms and legs, and there's an older fracture, probably a broken rib that was never treated. These injuries suggest that the baby wasn't just neglected, but possibly harmed in other ways before it was abandoned." Ethan's blood ran cold at the words. The thought of someone intentionally hurting a baby made his stomach turn, a deep, sickening anger bubbling up inside him. How could anyone do that to something so helpless, so innocent? His fists clenched on his lap, his nails digging into his palms as he tried to process the information. He had thought finding the baby in the trash was bad enough, but now, knowing that the infant had been hurt beforehand, it was almost too much to bear. Dr. Harper must have seen the emotion on Ethan's face, because he softened his tone, leaning forward slightly. "Ethan, I know this is a lot to take in," he said gently, "but I want you to know that you did everything right. You saved that baby's life by getting it here when you did. Without your quick thinking, the baby wouldn't have survived." Ethan nodded slowly, though the words barely registered. All he could think about was the baby's bruised body, the tiny ribs that had been broken and left untreated. The guilt washed over him in waves. He had found the baby, yes, but that didn't change the fact that someone had left it there to die. The idea that there was a person out there, someone who had hurt the baby and then abandoned it without a second thought, made Ethan feel sick. "What happens now?" he asked after a long moment, his voice small and uncertain. "What happens to the baby?" Dr. Harper leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest as he considered his response. "Well, the first priority is getting the baby healthy again. That could take a few days or even weeks, depending on how it responds to treatment. But once the baby is stable, social services will take over. They'll investigate the circumstances of the abandonment, and they'll be working with the police to try and find out who left the baby in the alley." "The police?" Ethan repeated, feeling a sudden jolt of nerves. "They're going to arrest someone." Dr. Harper hesitated, his expression growing more thoughtful. "That depends on what they find. If they can locate the mother or whoever was responsible for the baby's care, there will definitely be legal consequences. But it's not always as simple as arresting someone. Sometimes people do terrible things out of desperation. We don't know what the circumstances are yet." Ethan's stomach twisted again. Desperation, that word stuck with him. He had been thinking all along that whoever left the baby in the trash must have been cruel, heartless. But now, hearing Dr. Harper talk about it, he wondered if there was more to the story. Could someone have abandoned their child out of fear or desperation? Was it possible that they had been pushed to the edge, unable to care for the baby and not knowing where to turn? It didn't make sense to him, even if they had been desperate. How could anyone justify leaving a baby to die like that? But as much as he wanted to be angry, there was a part of him that couldn't shake the feeling that maybe there was more to it. Maybe whoever had done this was just as lost and scared as the baby had been. What if they don't find the mother? Ethan asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. If they don't find the mother, or if she's deemed unfit to care for the child, then the baby will go into the foster care system, Dr. Harper explained. Eventually, if the baby's biological family can't be located or if they aren't suitable guardians, the child could be put up for adoption. Adoption. The word hung in the air like a promise and a threat all at once. Ethan had known kids at school who were adopted, and for some of them it had worked out okay. They had families who loved them, who gave them homes, but for others it hadn't gone so well. He thought of his friend Jake, whose foster parents had been cold and distant, more interested in the government checks than in Jake himself. Ethan's mind raced with questions he didn't know how to ask. What would happen to the baby after this? Would it be bounced around from home to home, never really finding a place where it belonged, or would it end up with a family who actually cared? The uncertainty of it all made his chest ache. Will I ever see the baby again? Ethan asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Dr. Harper seemed surprised by the question. That depends on what happens next, he said carefully. Once social services takes over, they'll be in charge of the baby's welfare. It's possible that you could stay updated on the baby's condition, but once the legal process starts, it's largely out of our hands. Ethan nodded slowly, though his heart sank at the thought. He had found the baby, brought it to the hospital, but now it felt like everything was slipping away. It felt wrong somehow to just walk away from it all now. He had been there at the start. Didn't that mean something? Didn't that give him some sort of responsibility? But he wasn't family. He wasn't an adult. And he wasn't a part of the legal system that was now taking over. The feeling of helplessness gnawed at him, tightening in his chest. Before Ethan could ask anything else, there was a knock on the door. A tall man with dark hair and a serious expression stepped into the room, his presence filling the space. He wore a dark suit and a badge clipped to his belt. Ethan immediately knew this was the detective Dr. Harper had mentioned earlier. Ethan, I'm Detective Harper, the man said, his voice calm but firm. He held a notepad in one hand, flipping it open as he sat down across from the boy. I need to ask you a few questions about what happened today. It won't take long, but we need as much information as possible. Ethan nodded, his heart racing again. He had known this was coming. The police had to be involved, but now that it was happening, it felt more real. His hands fidgeted in his lap, and he struggled to keep his breathing steady. The detective gave him a reassuring look. You're not in trouble, Ethan. You did a really good thing today, but we need to understand what happened so we can help the baby and figure out who's responsible. Ethan nodded again, though his throat felt tight. Let's start from the beginning, Detective Harper said, his pen poised over the notepad. Tell me everything you remember. How did you find the baby? Ethan took a deep breath, his mind racing back to that moment in the alley. He described everything as best he could. The shortcut he always took to school, the strange silence that had made him stop, the faint cry that had led him to the trash pile. He told the detective how he had been too scared at first to check, how he had hesitated, unsure if he even wanted to see what was making that sound. But then when he couldn't ignore it anymore, he had uncovered the baby, lying there so still and cold. As he spoke, he could feel the tension in the room building, the weight of what he had witnessed hanging over him like a shadow. The detective listened carefully, jotting down notes but not interrupting. When Ethan finished, he sat back, his hands still shaking slightly. Did you see anyone near the alley when you found the baby? Detective Harper asked, his tone more intense now. Any cars or people who might have been acting suspiciously? Ethan shook his head. No, it was really quiet. I didn't see anyone. The detective's expression didn't change, but he scribbled something in his notebook before closing it. All right, thank you, Ethan. That helps a lot. We'll be investigating the area, checking for security cameras or any witnesses who might have seen something. Ethan swallowed hard. The thought of someone out there, someone who had left the baby to die, made his skin crawl. And now, knowing that the baby had been hurt before it was abandoned, it was all too much. He wanted to ask what would happen next, if they would catch the person responsible, but the words stuck in his throat. Detective Harper stood up, giving Ethan a small nod before heading for the door. You've done everything you can, he said as he left. We'll take it from here. And then, just like that, he was gone, leaving Ethan alone with Dr. Harper once more. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan sat there, staring at the floor, his mind spinning with everything he had just heard. The baby was stable, but still at risk. The police were looking for the mother, or whoever had left the child in the alley, and somewhere in all of this, Ethan felt like he was losing his grip on everything. He had found the baby. He had been the one to bring it to the hospital, but now it felt like things were slipping away from him, like his role in this was over, even though it didn't feel like it should be. Dr. Harper stood up slowly, his face softening as he looked at Ethan. "I know this is a lot to process," he said gently. "If you need to talk to anyone, we have counselors here who can help. You've been through a very traumatic experience today, and it's okay to feel overwhelmed." Ethan shook his head. "I'm fine," he mumbled, though he wasn't sure if that was true. He didn't know what he felt. His chest ached, and his mind was a whirl of thoughts and questions that he couldn't sort through. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away now. Not yet. Not when everything felt so unfinished. Dr. Harper gave him a long, thoughtful look before finally speaking again. "If you ever want an update on the baby's condition, you can call the hospital. We'll keep you informed as much as we can, all right?" Ethan nodded, though his heart sank. He wanted to do more than just get updates. He wanted to be there to see the baby get better, to know for sure that it was safe. But he knew that wasn't possible. He wasn't family. He was just the kid who had found the baby, that's all. As Dr. Harper left the room, Ethan sat there alone, staring out the window at the darkening sky. The world outside felt distant, detached from everything that had happened today. It was as if the rest of the world had kept spinning while his life had been thrown into chaos. He felt small, powerless, and more alone than ever. For the first time since finding the baby, Ethan let himself cry. Ethan stood outside the hospital, the cold air biting at his skin as he zipped up his coat and shoved his hands deep into his pockets. The weight of everything that had happened in the last 24 hours hung heavy on his shoulders. He hadn't slept, he hadn't been able to. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the baby's tiny body lying in the trash, so fragile, so helpless. The hospital staff had told him to go home, to rest, but how could he? It felt wrong to just walk away, to leave the baby in someone else's hands and pretend everything was normal. But after hours of waiting, of sitting in that sterile, suffocating room, he had no choice. They couldn't give him any more updates. The baby was still in critical condition, and all they could do now was wait. Social services had already been notified, and the investigation had started. Soon, the police would be involved. It was out of his hands now, even though it didn't feel like it should be. As he walked down the empty street, his breath visible in the chilly October air, Ethan's thoughts spiraled. What was going to happen to the baby? Would they find the mother? Would she be arrested? He couldn't shake the image of the bruises, the broken rib, things that had happened before the baby had been abandoned. The idea that someone had hurt the baby made his stomach churn with anger. But the more he thought about it, the more confused he became. Who would do something like that, and why? He had tried asking Dr. Harper more questions, but the doctor hadn't had many answers. Everything was still too uncertain, too early. The investigation would take time. And even then, Ethan wasn't sure if he would ever get the closure he needed. He wasn't family, he wasn't part of the system. He was just a kid who had found the baby, who had done the right thing, but was it enough? The following morning, Ethan woke up with the same uneasy feeling in his chest. He hadn't been able to stay asleep for long. His dreams filled with haunting images of the alley and the baby's cries. He got dressed quickly, his mind already set on going back to the hospital. He needed to know if there was any change. He couldn't just sit at home and do nothing. His dad, noticing his restlessness at breakfast, looked at him with concern. "You okay, Ethan?" he asked, setting down his coffee cup. "You barely ate last night, and now you're rushing off again." Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to explain the weight he was carrying. I need to check on something," he muttered, pushing his cereal around in the bowl. He hadn't told his dad everything yet. The words felt too heavy, too complicated. How could he explain the overwhelming need he felt to see this through? To know that the baby was going to be okay? "Something at school," his dad pressed, frowning slightly. "You've been distracted since yesterday." Ethan shook his head. "Not school, He stopped, swallowing hard. "There's this baby. I found it yesterday in the alley behind the shops. Someone left it there, Dad. It was really bad and I had to take it to the hospital." His dad's face paled, the casual concern shifting into something more serious. "A baby," he repeated, his voice low. "Ethan, why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't know how," Ethan admitted, his voice shaking. "It all happened so fast, and I don't know what's going to happen to it now. I just feel like I can't walk away." His dad leaned back in his chair, processing what Ethan had just told him. After a long pause, and he spoke again, his tone more gentle this time. "Ethan, that's a lot for anyone to go through, let alone you. But you did the right thing by getting that baby to the hospital. I'm proud of you." Ethan nodded, but the words didn't bring him the comfort he wanted. He appreciated his dad's support, but it wasn't enough to quiet the worry that gnawed at him. "I just want to check on the baby," he said quietly. "I need to know if it's okay." His dad sighed softly, standing up and placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I get it, kid. If you want, I can drive you to the hospital." Ethan looked up at his dad, surprised by the offer. "Really?" "Yeah," his dad said, offering a small smile. "Let's go. You've got a big heart, Ethan. I don't want you carrying this on your own." The drive to the hospital was quiet, the streets still damp from the early morning mist. Ethan stared out the window, his mind still racing with thoughts about the baby. His dad hadn't said much after their conversation at breakfast, but his presence was reassuring in a way. It made Ethan feel less alone, like someone else understood how important this was. When they arrived at the hospital, Ethan's heart raced as he walked through the familiar automatic doors. He half expected the same nurse from the day before to be there, but the front desk had a new face, a younger nurse who smiled politely as Ethan and his dad approached. "Hi," Ethan said nervously. I'm here to check on a baby. I brought it in yesterday." The nurse's expression softened as she glanced at the computer in front of her. "You mean the baby that was abandoned?" Ethan nodded, his chest tightening at the word abandoned. "Yeah, that one." The nurse typed something into the system before nodding. "The baby's stable for now. The doctors are still monitoring closely, but it's a positive sign that the condition hasn't worsened overnight." A wave of relief washed over Ethan. Stable. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was better than the uncertainty he had felt all night. "Can I see it?" The nurse hesitated, her smile faltering. "I'm afraid you can't visit the baby directly. It's still in the intensive care unit, and only medical staff and social services are allowed in at this stage. But I can get Dr. Harper to give you an update if you'd like." Ethan's heart sank a little, but he nodded. "Okay, that would be great. Thanks." As the nurse walked away to find the doctor, Ethan sat down in the waiting area with his dad, trying to calm the mix of emotions swirling inside him. The knowledge that the baby was stable brought some comfort, but it didn't solve the bigger questions weighing on his mind. What would happen next? Would the baby get better? Would they find the person responsible? And what about the baby's future? Where would it go? His dad, sensing his unease, gave him a gentle nudge. "You're doing good, Ethan. I know it's hard not to feel like you're in control, but you've done more than most people would." "I just don't know what's going to happen to the baby," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if it never gets adopted? What if it gets lost in the system?" His dad's face softened with understanding. "That's a tough question, and I wish I had an answer for you. But I do know that because of you, that baby has a chance, and that's something no one can take away." Before Ethan could respond, Dr. Harper appeared, walking toward them with a kind but tired smile. "Ethan R.," he greeted. "I heard you were here. I'm glad you came back." Ethan stood up quickly, anxious for an update. "Is the baby still okay?" Dr. Harper nodded. "Yes, the baby's stable, which is a good sign. We're still monitoring closely, but things are moving in the right direction. The baby's vitals have improved overnight, and we're working on getting it stronger with fluids and proper nutrition." Ethan's shoulders sagged with relief, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's great news." Dr. Harper's expression remained serious, though. "There's still a long road ahead. The baby's condition was critical when you brought it in, so we're taking it one step at a time. But you should be proud of what you did. You saved that child's life." Ethan nodded, but the doctor's praise, while appreciated, wasn't enough to ease the tension in his chest. There was still so much uncertainty, so much that could go wrong. And then there was the looming question that had been gnawing at him since the night before. What would happen to the baby next? As if reading his thoughts, Dr. Harper sighed softly before continuing. Social services is involved now. They'll be handling the baby's case from here on out. The police are still investigating, trying to track down whoever left the baby in the alley, but that could take time. Ethan's stomach twisted at the thought. What happens if they don't find the person who did it? What happens to the baby then? Dr. Harper exchanged a look with Ethan's dad before answering. If the biological family can't be found, or if they're deemed unfit, the baby will likely go into foster care. It's too soon to say what the long-term outcome will be, but the important thing is that the baby will be in a safe environment, whether that's through foster care or adoption. Ethan's heart sank at the word foster care. He knew what that could mean. A life of being bounced from home to home, never really belonging anywhere. He had seen it with his friend Jake, who had been in and out of foster homes for years before being adopted by a family that didn't really care about him. The thought of that happening to the baby made his chest ache. Is there anything I can do? Ethan asked, his voice barely audible. Dr. Harper gave him a sad smile. You've already done so much, Ethan. Right now, the best thing you can do is trust the system to take care of the baby. I know it's hard, but you've given that child a chance at life. That's no small thing. Ethan wanted to argue, to say that it wasn't enough, but he didn't have the words. Instead, he nodded quietly, trying to process everything the doctor had said. His dad placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. Come on, his dad said softly. Let's get you home. We can come back tomorrow if you want to check in again. Ethan hesitated, his eyes lingering on the hallway that led to the ICU. He wanted to stay, to be close to the baby, but he knew there was nothing more he could do right now. With a heavy heart, he followed his dad out of the hospital, the weight of everything pressing down on him as they walked to the car. The next few days were a blur of school, restless nights, and constant worry. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the baby, wondering if it was getting stronger, if the doctors had found any new complications. Every morning before school and every afternoon after, he and his dad would stop by the hospital for an update. Each time, the news was cautiously optimistic, stable, improving, but still critical. It wasn't the reassurance Ethan wanted, but it was enough to keep him going. On the fourth day, when Ethan and his dad arrived at the hospital, Dr. Harper had news that sent Ethan's heart racing. The baby's been moved out of intensive care, Dr. Harper said with a smile. We're not out of the woods yet, but this is a very positive step. Ethan felt a surge of relief. Can I see the baby now? Dr. Harper hesitated for a moment before nodding. I can arrange for a brief visit, but only for a few minutes. Social services has been very strict about limiting visitors, but given your role in saving the baby, I'll make an exception. Ethan's heart pounded as he followed Dr. Harper down the hallway. His dad waited in the lobby, understanding Ethan's need to do this alone. As they reached the nursery, Ethan's pulse quickened. He had imagined this moment for days, seeing the baby, knowing it was okay. But now that it was about to happen, a part of him was terrified. What if the baby didn't recognize him? What if it didn't matter that he had been the one to save it? Dr. Harper led Ethan to a small room, where the baby lay in a bassinet, wrapped in a clean, soft blanket. The sight of the baby, so much healthier than the last time Ethan had seen it, brought tears to his eyes. The baby's skin was no longer pale and fragile looking. It was still small, still vulnerable, but there was life in the way its tiny chest rose and fell steadily. Hey, Ethan whispered, stepping closer to the bassinet. He reached out, his hand hovering above the baby's tiny fingers, unsure if he should touch them. It's me. The baby stirred slightly, a soft coo escaping its lips, and Ethan's heart swelled. He didn't know how long he stood there, just watching. But in that moment, everything else, the investigation, the uncertainty, the fear, faded away. For the first time in days, Ethan felt hope. Ethan's visits to the hospital became less frequent after that. The baby continued to improve, and social services became more involved, slowly taking control of the situation. It was bittersweet for Ethan, knowing that the baby's future was now in the hands of a system he had no control over. But Dr. Harper had promised to keep him updated, and that gave him some comfort. Weeks passed, and soon the baby was discharged from the hospital, placed into the custody of social services. Ethan never got to know the baby's fate, whether it was adopted, placed in foster care, or reunited with family, but he carried the memory of those days with him, a reminder of the connection he had shared with the child. However brief, in the end, Ethan understood that saving the baby had changed him in ways he couldn't have imagined. It had made him realize the importance of compassion, of stepping up when no one else would. And while he didn't have all the answers, he knew one thing for certain: he had made a difference. And that was enough. The sun was setting over Ashbury, casting a golden light over the streets as Ethan walked home from school. It had been a month since the baby had left the hospital, and though life had slowly returned to normal, a part of him still felt unsettled. He often found his thoughts drifting back to the baby, wondering where it was now, whether it was in a foster home or with a new family. No one had given him any updates since the baby was discharged, and while Dr. Harper had done his best to keep him informed, it was clear that once social services took over, the process became a private matter. Ethan had come to terms with that as much as he could, but the uncertainty lingered. He had become attached to the baby in a way he hadn't expected, and the idea of not knowing what had happened felt like an open wound that hadn't quite healed. His dad had tried to reassure him, telling him that the baby was safe now, that he had done everything he could, but Ethan wasn't sure if that was enough. As he turned the corner onto his street, he saw a familiar figure sitting on the front steps of his house. His heart skipped a beat when he recognized Dr. Harper, still in his white coat, though it looked a little more rumpled than usual. The doctor stood as Ethan approached, a smile on his face that was both warm and tired. "Dr. Harper?" Ethan asked, surprised to see him outside of the hospital. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to give you some news," Dr. Harper said, stepping down from the porch. "I figured you deserved to hear it in person." Ethan's heart began to race, a mixture of hope and fear bubbling up inside him. "Is it about the baby?" Dr. Harper nodded. "Yes. I know it's been a long time since we last talked, and I wanted to give you an update. The investigation is still ongoing, but the baby's been placed with a foster family for now. It's a temporary placement, but the good news is that the baby's doing very well. The foster parents are loving and attentive, and social services is optimistic about finding a permanent home soon." A wave of relief washed over Ethan. The idea of the baby being in a loving home, even temporarily, eased some of the weight that had been pressing on him for weeks. That's great," Ethan said, his voice catching slightly. "I'm glad," Dr. Harper smiled gently. "I thought you'd like to know. You've been through a lot these past few weeks, and I know how much you've cared about the baby. You made a difference, Ethan, more than you realize." Ethan looked down at his feet, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness. I just want to know that the baby's going to be okay. That it'll have a good life, you know." Dr. Harper nodded, his expression understanding. "I think it will. The baby has a real chance now, thanks to you. But I also wanted to tell you something else." Ethan looked up, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" "The foster family has asked if you'd like to stay involved," Dr. Harper said, his tone careful. "They know about what you did, and they're open to the idea of you visiting the baby if that's something you want." Ethan blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. "I can visit, really?" Dr. Harper smiled. "Yes, really. It would be a way for you to stay connected, to be a part of the baby's life, even if it's just in small ways." For a moment, Ethan was too stunned to respond. He had thought that once the baby was placed with a family, his involvement would be over. He had prepared himself for that reality, even if it hurt. But now, hearing that he could still be a part of the baby's life, something inside him shifted, a sense of hope, of possibility, that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks. "I'd love that," Ethan finally said, his voice filled with emotion. "I'd really love that." Dr. Harper nodded, his smile growing wider. "I thought you might. I'll give the foster family your information, and they can set up a time for you to visit. It might take a little while, but I'm sure it'll happen soon." Ethan felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the day he found the baby. "Thank you, Dr. Harper," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for everything." The doctor placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to thank me, Ethan. You're the one who saved that baby's life. I just did my job." As Dr. Harper turned to leave, Ethan stood on the porch watching him walk down the street. The weight that had been pressing on him for weeks had finally lifted, replaced by a sense of peace he hadn't expected to find. The baby was safe, and though the future was still uncertain, Ethan knew that he had done everything he could. And now, he had the chance to be a part of the baby's life in a way he hadn't thought possible. The first visit came a few weeks later. Ethan had been anxious the entire day, his mind racing with thoughts about what it would be like to see the baby again. The foster family, the Whitmans, lived just outside of Ashbury in a small, cozy house with a big garden. When Ethan and his dad pulled up to the house, he could see a swing set in the yard, and the sight of it made his heart swell. This was a place where a child could be happy, where a child could grow up safe and loved. Mrs. Whitman, a kind woman in her 40s with warm brown eyes, greeted them at the door. She welcomed Ethan in with a smile, her presence calming his nerves. "We're so happy you're here, Ethan," she said, leading him into the living room. "The baby's just waking up from a nap. You'll get to see him in a minute." Him. Ethan felt a jolt of surprise at the pronoun. He hadn't known whether the baby was a boy or a girl, and hearing it now, it made everything feel more real. Him. The baby was a boy. Mrs. Whitman disappeared into the next room, and a few moments later she returned with the baby in her arms. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he saw the little boy, so much healthier and stronger than the last time he had seen him. The bruises were gone, replaced by rosy cheeks, and his small body was wrapped in a soft blue onesie. The baby's eyes, bright and curious, blinked up at Ethan as Mrs. Whitman placed him in a bouncy chair on the floor. "Here he is," Mrs. Whitman said softly. "His name is James, but you can call him Jamie if you'd like." Ethan knelt down next to the chair, his heart swelling with emotion as he looked at the baby. Jamie. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing against Jamie's tiny hand. The baby cooed softly, his eyes following Ethan's movements with fascination. "Hi, Jamie," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's me. I'm the one who found you." Jamie blinked up at him, his little fingers curling around Ethan's in a soft, gentle grip. It was such a small thing, but to Ethan it felt like the world. In the weeks and months that followed, Ethan visited Jamie often. The Whitmans welcomed him with open arms, allowing him to be a part of Jamie's life in a way that made him feel like he belonged. As Jamie grew stronger, Ethan found himself growing too, learning the importance of kindness, of compassion, of stepping up when no one else would. The future was still uncertain. Ethan knew that Jamie's situation could change at any time. Social services could find a permanent family, or the legal process could take a different turn. But for now, Jamie was safe, happy, and loved. And for Ethan, that was enough. As he stood in the Whitmans' garden one sunny afternoon, watching Jamie play on the grass, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace. The journey that had started in an alley, with fear and uncertainty, had led him here, to a place where hope was possible, where love was stronger than the darkness that had once threatened to swallow Jamie's life. Ethan smiled, knowing that whatever happened next, he had made a difference. He had saved Jamie's life. And in doing so, he had found something precious, too, a sense of purpose, of connection that would stay with him forever. Because sometimes, in the most unexpected ways, life gives you a second chance. And Ethan had taken it. A boy runs into the hospital carrying a baby in his arms. The reason brings even the doctor to tears. The July sun beat down mercilessly on the streets of Millbrook, Connecticut, turning the asphalt into a shimmering mirage. Mateo Sanchez, a 10-year-old boy with unruly black hair and curious hazel eyes, pedaled his battered bicycle down Maple Avenue, dodging sweat puddles that the heat pulled from the pavement. "Mateo, don't go too far," shouted his mother, Elena, from the doorway of the small apartment they shared on the second floor of a red brick building. Elena, with her apron still on and her hair tied in a tight bun, watched her son with a mix of pride and concern. "And don't forget your water bottle." Mateo waved his hand to show he had heard, but his mind was already elsewhere. Oak Grove Park called to him like an oasis in the middle of the urban desert. There, under the shade of ancient oaks, he could escape the stifling heat and maybe find some friends to play soccer with. As he pedaled, Mateo couldn't help but notice how the shutters on the houses were drawn like heavy eyelids, shielding themselves from the relentless sun. The streets were almost deserted except for a brave few walking their dogs or rushing toward the safety of air conditioning. When he reached the park, Mateo dropped his bike next to a bench and headed for the water fountain. The cool water momentarily eased the heat he felt, but it couldn't extinguish the spark of disappointment at seeing the park nearly empty. No sign of his usual friends. "I guess I'll have to settle for my own company today," he murmured to himself, kicking a solitary stone. That's when he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to come from the parking lot across the street. Mateo strained his ears, intrigued. The sound repeated, clearer this time. It was the cry of a baby. With his heart beating a little faster, Mateo crossed the street, his eyes scanning the small parking lot. There were only 3 cars, all locked and seemingly empty under the scorching sun. But the crying continued, growing weaker. He approached an old blue Chevrolet, the only one with the windows slightly open. The heat radiating from the car was suffocating, even from outside. Mateo stood on tiptoes to peer through the rear window, and what he saw chilled his blood despite the heat. In a baby seat, a small creature no more than 6 months old weakly squirmed. Her face was red and covered in sweat, her movements increasingly sluggish. Mateo looked around desperately for help, but the street remained empty. "Hello? Is anyone there?" he shouted with all his might, but only the echo of his own voice answered. Time seemed to stand still. Mateo knew he had to act fast. Without thinking twice, he grabbed a stone from the ground and, with all the strength he could muster, smashed it against the car's rear window. The glass shattered, superficially cutting Mateo's hand, but he barely noticed. Carefully avoiding further injury, Mateo managed to open the door from the inside. A wave of hot air hit him along with the now louder cries of the baby. With trembling but determined hands, he unbuckled the seatbelt and lifted the little girl out. She was burning up. Her normally soft skin felt like sandpaper under Mateo's touch. The boy looked around once more, hoping against all odds that someone, an adult who knew what to do, would appear. But they were still alone. "Hang in there, little one," Mateo whispered, though his own voice trembled. "I'm going to get you out of here." Without thinking further, Mateo started running. He knew that Millbrook General Hospital was only a few blocks away. He had passed by it many times on his bike but had never gone inside. Now, with the baby in his arms, every step felt like an eternity. The asphalt burned under his worn-out sneakers and sweat blurred his vision, but Mateo didn't stop. The little girl in his arms had almost stopped crying, and that scared him more than anything. "Hold on, please," Mateo panted as he ran. "We're almost there." The people he passed stared at him in astonishment and confusion, but Mateo didn't have time to explain. His world had shrunk to his moving legs and the precious bundle in his arms. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the glass doors of the hospital appeared in front of him. With one last effort, Mateo burst into the emergency room, the cool indoor air hitting him like a wave. "I help," he shouted with the last of his strength. "Please, help her." The hospital staff reacted immediately. A nurse took the baby from Mateo's arms while another led him to a chair. Dr. Robert Thompson, who happened to be nearby, quickly joined the team attending to the little girl. "What happened?" Thompson asked, his blue eyes quickly assessing the situation. Between gasps, Mateo managed to explain what had happened. "Doctor," Thompson's face hardened as he listened to the baby being abandoned in the car, but his hands worked with precision and calm. "You did the right thing, kid," the doctor said, his voice mixing professionalism with an emotion he couldn't completely hide. "You probably saved her life." While the medical team worked frantically to stabilize the baby, Mateo sank into the chair, exhaustion and adrenaline finally taking their toll. He looked at his trembling hands, noticing the cuts from the broken glass for the first time. A nurse came over to treat his wounds, but Mateo barely noticed her. His eyes were fixed on the door through which they had taken the baby, his mind replaying the events of the last few hours. "Will she be okay?" Mateo asked, his voice barely a whisper. The nurse smiled kindly as she cleaned his cuts. "Thanks to you, she has a good chance." "You're a real hero, you know." Mateo didn't feel like a hero. He felt small, scared, and very, very tired. But he also felt something else, something he couldn't quite name. It was as if, in that moment, he had discovered a part of himself he didn't know existed. As the activity around him continued, Mateo closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the hospital envelop him. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew nothing would ever be the same again. In that sweltering summer day in Millbrook, Connecticut, Mateo Sanchez's life had changed forever. The constant hum of machines and the comings and goings of medical staff set the rhythm in the emergency room at Millbrook General Hospital. Mateo, seated in an uncomfortable plastic chair, kept his gaze fixed on the door where Dr. Thompson and the baby had disappeared. His bandaged hands rested on his trembling knees. "Mateo Sanchez," called a firm but kind voice. The boy looked up to meet a middle-aged woman with brown hair pulled back into a tight bun and piercing eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. She wore a gray pantsuit and held a folder in her hands. "I'm the social worker, Sarah Collins," she introduced herself, sitting next to Mateo. "Do you mind if we talk for a moment?" Mateo nodded silently, his throat suddenly dry. "What you did today was very brave," Sarah began, her voice softening. "But I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Every detail is important." As Mateo recounted the events of the afternoon, Sarah took notes, occasionally nodding. Her professional expression only broke for a moment when Mateo described how he broke the car window. "You know that's technically illegal?" Sarah asked, though her tone lacked reproach. Mateo felt his heart race. I just wanted to help," he stammered, fear coloring his voice. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "I know, Mateo, and you did the right thing. But this complicates things a little. Do your parents know you're here?" Mateo's face paled. Amid the chaos, he had completely forgotten about his parents. "No, my mom thinks I'm at the park," he replied, guilt evident in his voice. Sarah sighed, pulling out her phone. "We need to contact them immediately. Can you give me their number?" While Sarah stepped away to make the call, Mateo felt the weight of his actions begin to settle on his shoulders. What would his parents say? Would they get in trouble for what he had done? His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Thompson, who emerged from the treatment room with an expression of exhaustion but relief on his face. "The baby is stable," he announced, addressing both Mateo and Sarah, who had just returned. "She has a severe case of hyperthermia, but she got here just in time. A few more hours in that car." His voice trailed off, the implication clear to all. Mateo felt a knot in his chest loosen slightly. "Can I see her?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Dr. Thompson looked at Sarah, who nodded slightly. "And only for a moment," the doctor agreed. "She's in the neonatal intensive care unit." Following Dr. Thompson through the hospital corridors, Mateo felt as if he were in a dream. The smell of disinfectant and the muffled sound of conversations and machines created a surreal atmosphere. The neonatal intensive care unit was a world apart. Incubators and monitors occupied most of the space, each housing a small fighter. Dr. Thompson led Mateo to a particular incubator, where the baby he had rescued lay. She looked so small and fragile, connected to tubes and wires. Her skin, once red and irritated, now had a healthier tone. Mateo placed his bandaged hand on the plastic of the incubator as if wanting to touch her. "She's a fighter," Dr. Thompson remarked softly. "Thanks to you, she has a chance." Mateo couldn't hold back the tears that had been threatening to fall since he arrived at the hospital. How could someone leave her like that?" he sobbed. Dr. Thompson placed a hand on Mateo's shoulder. "Sometimes people make desperate decisions when they're in desperate situations. But the important thing is that she's safe now." The moment was interrupted by the hurried arrival of Elena and Carlos Sanchez, Mateo's parents. Elena, with red, tearful eyes, rushed to her son, enveloping him in a fierce embrace. "My boy, thank God you're okay," she exclaimed, alternating between kisses and scolding in rapid Spanish. Carlos, for his part, stayed a step back, his face a mix of relief and concern. His eyes darted nervously between his son and the adults present. Sarah approached, her expression professional but understanding. "Mr. and Mrs. Sanchez, I'm Sarah Collins, a social worker. We need to talk about what happened today." Carlos's face visibly tensed. "Is Mateo in trouble?" he asked, his accent more pronounced due to stress. "Not exactly," Sarah replied, choosing her words carefully. "But the situation is complicated." As the group moved to a private conference room, Mateo couldn't help but notice how his father walked with his shoulders hunched, as if carrying an invisible weight. The worried expression on his mother's face made his stomach twist with guilt. In the conference room, Sarah explained the situation in detail. from Mateo's discovery to the baby's current condition. Elena sobbed quietly while Carlos listened with an increasingly grim expression. Mateo acted heroically, Sarah concluded. But the fact is there was damage to private property, and the police will need to speak with him as a key witness. Carlos stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "No," he said firmly. "We won't talk to the police." The silence that followed was heavy and tense. Sarah looked at Carlos with a mix of understanding and frustration. "Mr. Sanchez, I understand your concern, but—" "No, you don't understand," Carlos interrupted, his voice trembling slightly. Our situation here is complicated." Understanding dawned on Sarah's face. "Oh," she said softly. "I see." Mateo looked confused between his father and Sarah. "What's going on, Dad?" he asked. Elena took her son's hand, her eyes filled with tears. "Son, there are things we haven't told you about how we came to this country." The revelation hit Mateo like a bucket of cold water. His parents, the people he admired most in the world, were undocumented. Suddenly, many things made sense. Why his father worked so many different jobs. Why his mother always seemed nervous when she saw a police car. Why they had never visited family in Mexico. But I was born here," Mateo stammered, trying to process the information. "Yes, my love," Elena replied, stroking his cheek. "You are a citizen. But we—" Sarah cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention. "This complicates things," she admitted. "But Mateo is a hero. He saved a life today. There must be a way to handle this without putting his family at risk." While the adults discussed possible solutions, Mateo felt as if the ground beneath his feet had turned to quicksand. Everything he thought he knew about his life, about his family, was changing, and all because of a decision made in a moment of crisis. The sound of a commotion outside the room interrupted the discussion. Through the window, they could see a group of reporters and cameramen in the hallway, trying to get information about the hero boy everyone was talking about. "This is getting out of control," Sarah murmured, massaging her temples. At that moment, Dr. Thompson entered the room hurriedly, his face a mix of excitement and concern. "We have news," he announced. The police found the baby's mother. Everyone turned to him expectantly. "She's a 19-year-old young woman," Dr. Thompson continued, "and they found her unconscious in an alley near the park. Apparently, she's a drug addict and overdosed shortly after, abandoning the baby." The news dropped like a bomb in the room. Elena crossed herself, murmuring a prayer in Spanish. Carlos clenched his fists, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Sarah seemed to be quickly processing the legal and social implications of this new information. Mateo, for his part, felt a surge of emotions he couldn't name. Anger at the mother who had abandoned her baby, compassion for the young woman clearly struggling with her own demons, fear for what this would mean for his family. "What happens now?" Mateo asked, his voice small in the tension-filled room. Sarah was the one to answer, her voice professional but kind. "It's complicated, Mateo. The baby will need a safe place while her mother receives treatment. And you, well, you're a key witness in a case that now involves child abandonment and substance abuse." Carlos stood up again, his face a mask of determination. "No," he said firmly. "We won't expose Mateo to that. We'll find another way." "Dad," Mateo intervened, surprising everyone with the firmness in his voice. "I did the right thing. We can't hide now." Elena sobbed softly, hugging her son. "Am I brave, my hero?" she murmured into his hair. Dr. Thompson, who had been quietly observing the scene, stepped forward. "Maybe," he began slowly. "There's a way to handle this that protects everyone involved." All eyes turned to him, a mix of hope and skepticism on their faces. "Mateo's story is powerful," Dr. Thompson continued. "It shows the best of our community, of humanity. If we handle it correctly, it could be an opportunity for change, not just for the baby and her mother, but for families like yours, Mr. Sanchez." Sarah nodded slowly, beginning to see the direction of the doctor's thoughts. A story of compassion and heroism could change the narrative, she reflected. But we would have to be very careful. As the adults began to discuss strategies and possibilities, Mateo found himself looking out the window at the hustle and bustle of the hospital. Somewhere in that maze of hallways and rooms, A little baby was fighting for her life. A young mother was facing her demons, and his own family's future hung in the balance. Matteo didn't fully understand all the complexities of the situation, but he knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same. His actions had created ripples in the pond of his small community, and those ripples would continue to expand in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As the sun began to set outside the hospital window, Matteo realized that this was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The next morning dawned with deceptive calm in Millbrook. The sun lazily rose over the rooftops of the small town, bathing the streets in a golden light that seemed to promise a new beginning. But for Matteo Sanchez and his family, the storm was just beginning. In the kitchen of their modest apartment, Elena Sanchez mechanically prepared breakfast, her mind clearly elsewhere. Carlos, seated at the table with an untouched cup of coffee in front of him, nervously scrolled through his phone. Matteo, for his part, picked at his plate of scrambled eggs, the knot in his stomach making each bite a challenge. The heavy, tension-laden silence was broken by the shrill sound of the phone. Carlos started, spilling some of his coffee before answering with trembling hands. Yes, I understand. We'll be there, he said before hanging up, his voice a hoarse whisper. Elena turned to him, the silent question in her eyes. It was the social worker, Sarah, Carlos explained, running a hand over his tired face. They want us to go to the hospital. Apparently, the story has leaked to the press. Matteo felt his heart race. What does that mean, Dad? Carlos looked at his son, his eyes a mix of pride and concern. It means things are going to change, son. For better or for worse. The trip to the hospital was tense and silent. The normally quiet streets of Millbrook buzzed with unusual activity. Local news vans lined up outside the hospital, reporters with microphones in hand eagerly awaiting the next scoop. Keep your head down, Matteo, instructed Elena as they made their way through the crowd. At the hospital reception, they were greeted by Sarah Collins, in whose face showed signs of a sleepless night. Thank you for coming so quickly, she said, guiding them to a private conference room. The situation has evolved. In the room, they found Dr. Thompson in a heated discussion with a man in a suit that Matteo didn't recognize. When the Sanchez family entered, both men fell abruptly silent. The Sanchez family, said the man in the suit, approaching with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm Richard Hawkins, legal advisor for the hospital. We have a lot to discuss. Over the next hour, Matteo listened in a state of bewilderment as his simple act of kindness had become the center of a media and legal whirlwind. The story of the immigrant hero boy had captured national attention, sparking debates on immigration, healthcare, and social services. The governor has expressed interest in the case, Hawkins explained, his voice a professional monotone. They see an opportunity for a public relations victory. They're considering using executive powers to grant temporary legal status to the Sanchez family. Carlos and Elena exchanged looks of astonishment and caution. And what about the baby? Elena asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Thompson spoke, his voice softening. Sophia, as we've temporarily named her, is improving, but her situation is complicated. Sarah took over, her tone professional but compassionate. Sophia's mother, Amber Johnson, is currently in rehab. She has expressed remorse for her actions and wishes to regain custody eventually, but the process will be long and difficult. Matteo, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke. Can I see her? Sophia, the adults exchanged glances, but it was Dr. Thompson who nodded. I think that would be good for both of you. As Matteo followed Dr. Thompson to the neonatal unit, he could feel the tension in the air like static electricity before a storm. The hospital corridors were unusually crowded, with staff and visitors whispering and discreetly pointing at the hero boy. In the NICU, Sophia lay in her incubator, her small body still connected to several monitors but noticeably stronger than the day before. Matteo placed his hand on the plastic, watching as the baby's chest rose and fell with each breath. Hello, Sophia, Matteo whispered. It's me, the boy who... Well, Dr. Thompson watched the scene with a mix of emotion and concern. You've formed a special bond with her, haven't you? He asked softly. Matteo nodded, not taking his eyes off Sophia. It's like she's my responsibility, I can't explain it. The doctor placed a hand on Mateo's shoulder. I understand. But remember, Mateo, that there are many people involved in this situation. People who will make decisions that affect Sofia's future. Before Mateo could respond, a commotion in the hallway caught his attention. Through the NICU window, he could see a group of people moving quickly. In the center of the group was a young woman with disheveled blonde hair and sunken eyes, walking with determination. It's her, Dr. Thompson murmured, visibly tensing. Carsa Amber Johnson, Sofia's mother. Mateo felt his heart race. This was the woman who had abandoned Sofia in that hot car. The woman whose actions had triggered all of this. And now she was here, just a few feet away. Amber entered the NICU, her eyes fixed on the incubator where Sofia lay. For a moment, she seemed not to notice anyone else in the room. Then her gaze fell on Mateo. "You," she said, her voice hoarse and heavy with emotion. "You're the boy who saved her." Mateo nodded, unable to form words. The air in the room seemed to have thickened, charged with unspoken emotions. Amber took a step toward Mateo, and for a moment, the boy feared she might attack him. But instead, Amber fell to her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you," she sobbed, grasping Mateo's hand. "Thank you for saving my baby, for doing what I couldn't." The scene was interrupted by the hurried arrival of Sarah, followed closely by Mateo's parents and several hospital security officers. "Amber," said Sarah, her voice firm but kind, "you shouldn't be here. You know there's a process we need to follow." Amber stood up, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. I know, but I had to see her. I had to thank this boy." Carlos approached Mateo, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "Son, are you okay?" he asked quietly. Mateo nodded, though his mind was spinning. Seeing Amber, hearing her gratitude and her pain, had added a new layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. Dr. Thompson intervened, his voice calm but authoritative. "I think we all need a moment to calm down. I suggest we meet in the conference room to discuss this in a civilized manner." As the group made their way to the conference room, Mateo couldn't help but notice the curious glances and whispers of hospital staff and visitors. The news of his heroic act had spread like wildfire, and now it seemed that everyone in Millbrook had an opinion on the case of the hero boy and the abandoned baby. In the conference room, the tension was palpable. Amber sat in a corner, flanked by Sarah and a man who introduced himself as her lawyer. The Sanchez family clustered on the opposite side of the table, with Mateo between his parents. Dr. Thompson and Richard Hawkins occupied the center, acting as impromptu mediators in this unfolding drama. "All right," Hawkins began, clearing his throat. "Oh, we're here to discuss Sofia's future and, by extension, the future of all the people involved in this extraordinary situation." Sarah took over, her tone professional but compassionate. "Amber has expressed her desire to regain custody of Sofia once she completes her rehabilitation program. However, given the nature of what happened, the process will be long and subject to strict supervision." Amber, her eyes red but determined, spoke. "I know I made a terrible mistake. I was in a very dark place. But I'm committed to changing, to being the mother that Sofia deserves." Elena, who had been listening in silence, leaned forward. "And what guarantee do we have that she won't hurt her again?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The question dropped like a bomb in the room. Amber paled while her lawyer rushed to intervene. "My client is following all the necessary steps for her recovery. It's not fair to judge her by her past actions when she's doing everything she can to change." Carlos Waum, who had remained silent until now, spoke with a calm but firm voice. We understand the desire for a second chance. We ourselves came to this country seeking one, but the child's safety must be the priority." The discussion continued, with arguments and counter-arguments flying across the table. Mateo watched in silence, feeling smaller and more overwhelmed by the minute. How had it come to this? Just 2 days ago, his biggest concern had been finding someone to play soccer with at the park. Suddenly, a knock on the door interrupted the heated debate. Thompson's ear. The doctor's face shifted from surprise to concern in a matter of seconds. "Everyone," Dr. Thompson said, standing up. "It seems we have a situation developing outside." They all rushed to the windows of the conference room, which overlooked the hospital's main entrance. What they saw took their breath away. A crowd had gathered outside the hospital. Hundreds of people held signs and chanted slogans. Some supported the Hero immigrant family, others called for justice for Amber, and a third group advocated for Sophia's rights above all else. "This has gotten out of control," Hawkins murmured, pulling out his phone to make frantic calls. Mateo watched the scene with a mix of awe and horror. Was all this because of him? Because of his decision to help a baby in danger? It was then that he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Among the crowd, he saw several of his classmates, including his best friend, Jason, and standing next to Jason, holding a sign that read, "Deport the illegals," was Jason's father, a man who had always been kind to Mateo. The reality of the situation hit Mateo with full force. This was no longer just about him and Sophia. It had become something much bigger, something that was dividing his community, pitting friends against friends, neighbors against neighbors. "Mom, Dad," Mateo said, his voice barely a whisper. What have we done?" Elena hugged her son, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. Carlos, for his part, stared out the window with a look of determination. "We did what was right, son," Carlos replied. "And now we have to face the consequences." "Doctor," Thompson turned to the group, his face grave. "I think it's time to make some difficult decisions. This situation is affecting not only Sophia and our families, but the entire community of Millbrook." Sarah nodded, pulling a folder from her briefcase. "I have several legal options here that we can consider. But before we get into the details, I think we all need to take a moment to reflect on what we really want for Sophia and for ourselves." Amber, who had been watching the scene outside with an expression of guilt and horror, turned to the group. I never wanted this to happen. I just wanted a chance to be a good mother." Mateo, feeling a surge of emotion he couldn't explain, walked over to Amber and took her hand. "And you deserve that chance," he said, surprising everyone in the room, including himself. But Sophia deserves to be safe and loved no matter what." Mateo's gesture seemed to break something in the room. Suddenly, the dividing lines that had been so clear moments before began to blur. Elena offered Amber a tissue. Carlos and Amber's lawyer began talking quietly, seeking common ground. As the adults started discussing possible solutions, Mateo found himself looking out the window again. The crowd outside was still growing, but now he noticed something different. On the edges, he saw small groups of people from both sides talking to each other, some even hugging. It was as if the chaos had reached a tipping point, and now slowly the pendulum was beginning to swing toward mutual understanding. It was in that moment that Mateo had an epiphany. He turned to the group of adults still heatedly debating. "Wait," he exclaimed, his voice stronger than it had ever been. Everyone stopped, surprised by the sudden intervention of the boy. "I think we're all forgetting something important," Mateo continued, his heart pounding but his voice clear. "This isn't about us, it's about Sophia, and all the other Sophias that might be out there." The silence that followed was profound. Encouraged by everyone's attention, Mateo pressed on. "Yes, I saved Sophia that day. But what if there are other children in danger that we don't see? What if there are other mothers like Amber who need help before they reach that point?" Amber sobbed softly, but there was a spark of something new in her eyes. "Hope. Maybe," Mateo continued, looking at each adult in the room. "Instead of fighting over who's right, we should think about how we can help make sure this doesn't happen again." "Doctor." Thompson was the first to break the silence that followed. "The boy's right," he said, a smile of admiration on his face. "We've been so focused on this particular case that we lost sight of the bigger picture." Sarah nodded, quickly flipping through her notes. "And we could propose a pilot program, something that combines health services, addiction support, and legal assistance for at-risk families. And education," added Elena, her voice soft but firm. "Education about immigrant rights and the resources available to them." Carlos, who had been listening intently, cleared his throat. "If our story can help others, I'm willing to share it. Maybe it's time we stopped hiding and started fighting for real change." Amber's lawyer, who had maintained a defensive posture until now, leaned forward with interest. "We could use this case as a catalyst for legislative change. There's precedent for high-profile cases leading to significant reforms." As the adults began drafting a plan of action, Mateo felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Amber. her eyes still wet but with a new determination in them. "Thank you," she said softly. Not just for saving Sophia, but for reminding all of us why you did it in the first place." Matteo nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time since all this began, he felt that things might actually get better. The rest of the afternoon passed in a whirlwind of activity. Calls were made, proposals were drafted, and plans were outlined. News of the Sophia Initiative, as they had named it, leaked to the press, and soon the crowd outside the hospital began changing their protest chants into cheers of support. As the sun began to set over Millbrook, painting the sky in warm tones, Matteo found himself once again in the NICU next to Sophia's incubator. This time, however, he wasn't alone. Beside him were his parents, Amber, Dr. Thompson, and Sarah. "You know, Doctor," Thompson said, breaking the contemplative silence. "In medicine, we talk a lot about the butterfly effect, the idea that a small change can have enormous, unforeseen consequences." Matteo nodded, remembering learning about it in school. "Wait, but what we often forget," the doctor continued, "is that those effects can be positive. Your act of kindness, Matteo, didn't just save Sophia. It set something much bigger in motion." Elena hugged her son, pride evident on her face. "My little hero," she murmured. Carlos, for his part, looked at his family, then at Amber, who was watching Sophia with a mix of love and determination. "I think," he said slowly, "that we've all been heroes today. And tomorrow, we'll have to be heroes again." As the group watched Sophia, who slept peacefully, unaware of the turmoil she had caused, Matteo reflected on the events of the past few days. It had all started as a simple act of kindness, an instinct to help someone in danger. And now, somehow, it had become the catalyst for a movement that could change lives. "Dr. Thompson," Matteo asked, a question forming in his mind, "do you think Sophia will remember any of this when she grows up?" The doctor smiled, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Probably not, Matteo, but that doesn't matter. Because thanks to you, thanks to all of us, she'll grow up in a slightly better world. And that, my young friend, is the greatest legacy anyone can leave." As night fell over Millbrook, a sense of hope and possibility hung in the air. The storm had passed, at least for now, and in its wake it had left the promise of a new dawn. A dawn where the actions of a brave boy had reminded an entire community of the power of compassion, unity, and positive change. Matteo looked at Sophia one last time before the group prepared to leave. "Sweet dreams, little one," he whispered. "The world is waiting for you." The following days in Millbrook passed in a whirlwind of activity. The small Connecticut town, which had until recently been little more than a footnote on the map, had become the epicenter of a national debate on immigration, healthcare, and social responsibility. Mateo Sanchez, the boy whose act of bravery had sparked it all, found himself at the center of a media hurricane. TV cameras and reporters camped outside his modest apartment building, hoping to catch a glimpse of the little hero. "I don't understand why they're so interested in me," Matteo murmured to his mother one morning as they peeked through the window. "I just did what anyone would have done." Elena hugged her son, kissing his forehead. "That's exactly why they're interested, son. Because you did the right thing without thinking twice. That's rare and special." Meanwhile, at Millbrook General Hospital, the Sophia Initiative was taking shape rapidly. Dr. Thompson, along with Sarah Collins and a team of public health and social work experts, worked tirelessly to turn the idea born in a moment of crisis into a viable program. The key, Dr. Thompson explained in a meeting, is prevention, identifying families at risk before they reach a critical situation like Amber and Sophia's. Sarah nodded, adding, "And for that, we need the community's cooperation. We can't do this alone." The Millbrook community, for its part, was responding in surprising ways. What had started as division was quickly becoming a unified effort. Local churches organized food and clothing drives for families in need. Business owners offered jobs to immigrants who had previously feared being hired. Even the local police station had announced new cultural sensitivity training policies. Amid all this, Amber Johnson, Sophia's mother, was facing her own journey of redemption. Every day after her therapy sessions and Narcotics Anonymous meetings, she visited her daughter at the hospital. "It's hard," she confessed to Mateo during one of these visits. The boy had made it a habit to stop by the hospital after school to check on Sophia. There are days when I just want to give up. But then I look at her and I know I have to be strong for her. Mateo, with wisdom beyond his years, took Amber's hand. My dad says being strong doesn't mean not being afraid. It means doing the right thing even when you're scared. Amber smiled through her tears. Your dad is a wise man. Speaking of Carlos Sanchez, Mateo's father had become an unexpected figure in the local immigration reform movement. His story, that of a man who had risked everything for a better future for his family, resonated deeply within the community. "We didn't come here to cause trouble," he said at a town council meeting that had gone viral on social media. "We came to work hard, to contribute, to be part of this great nation. And I think what my son did shows that we are part of this community, that we care about our neighbors no matter where they come from." His speech was met with a standing ovation, even from those who had previously been vocal in their opposition to undocumented immigration. As the weeks passed, the changes in Millbrook became increasingly evident. The hospital had established a mobile clinic that traveled to the neediest neighborhoods, offering free checkups and advice on social services. Mateo's school had launched a peer mentoring program, pairing immigrant students with local peers to help with language and cultural integration. But perhaps the most significant change was seen in the people themselves. Neighbors who had once barely greeted each other now stopped to chat, sharing stories and offering help. The distrust and fear that had divided the community were gradually being replaced by a sense of unity and shared purpose. A month after the incident that had started it all, Mateo found himself once again in the hospital's NICU. This time, however, it was a special occasion. Sophia, now strong and healthy, was ready to be discharged. "Are you ready for this, Doctor?" Thompson asked Amber, who held her daughter with a mix of love and nervousness. Amber looked around at the smiling faces of Mateo and his parents, of Sarah, of Dr. Thompson, and of the hospital staff she had come to know so well. "I'm not sure," she admitted. But I know I'm not alone." As the group prepared to accompany Amber and Sophia to their new home, an apartment provided by a transitional housing program, Mateo reflected on all that had changed in such a short time. "You know," he said to no one in particular, "when I found Sophia in that car, I thought I was saving a life. But I think I was actually saving a whole community." Elena hugged her son, tears shining in her eyes. "And in the process, son, you saved all of us." As they left the hospital, they were greeted by a small crowd of well-wishers. Neighbors, Mateo's classmates, even the mayor of Millbrook were there to celebrate this new beginning. Mateo looked around at the smiling, hopeful faces and felt a surge of emotion he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just happiness, though there was certainly plenty of that. It was something deeper, more enduring. It was the feeling that, despite all the challenges still ahead, Millbrook had found something precious, a sense of community, of belonging, of home. And it had all started with a simple act of kindness. The afternoon sun bathed Oak Grove Park in a golden glow, illuminating a scene that 6 months ago would have seemed improbable, if not impossible. Families of diverse backgrounds gathered to celebrate Millbrook Unity Day, a new festival commemorating the transformation of the small Connecticut town. At the center of it all, next to a modest makeshift stage, was Mateo Sanchez. The 11-year-old, he had celebrated his birthday the previous month, looked noticeably uncomfortable with all the attention, but his face lit up when he saw a familiar figure approaching. "Sophia," he exclaimed, extending his arms toward the baby that Amber Johnson proudly held. The little girl, now almost 9 months old, gurgled happily at the sight of Mateo. "I can't believe how big she's gotten," Mateo commented, gently tickling Sophia. Amber smiled. The exhaustion in her eyes mixed with undeniable determination. "She's growing faster than I can keep up with," she said. "But every day is a gift." The sound of a microphone being tested drew everyone's attention to the stage. The mayor of Millbrook, a middle-aged man with a genuine smile, cleared his throat. "Welcome, friends and neighbors, to the first Millbrook Unity Day," he began. About 6 months ago, our community was divided, fearful, and distrustful. Today, we come together as a family, stronger and more united than ever. As the mayor continued his speech, Mateo looked around. He saw his parents, Elena and Carlos, standing next to Dr. Thompson and Sarah Collins. He saw his classmates mingling freely with children who had once been considered different or outsiders. He saw former opponents of immigration chatting amicably with newly arrived families. And all of this, the mayor continued, started with the brave act of a child who reminded us that compassion knows no borders, that kindness requires no documents, and that a single act of love can change the world. Mateo Sanchez, would you join me on stage? With a gentle nudge from his mother, Mateo timidly climbed onto the stage, his cheeks reddening at the applause from the crowd. Mateo, the mayor said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. On behalf of the entire city of Millbrook, I want to thank you, not only for saving Sophia's life, but for saving all of us from our own prejudices and fears. The mayor turned to the audience. The Sophia Initiative, inspired by Mateo's actions, has helped over 100 families in the past 6 months. We've seen a 30% decrease in child neglect cases, a 50% increase in participation in addiction treatment programs, and an incredible 75% increase in community volunteerism. The applause that followed echoed through the park, but Mateo barely heard it. His mind was on that hot summer day, on the decision he made without a second thought. How could he have imagined the consequences of that simple act? And now, the mayor continued, I have the honor of announcing that the City Council has unanimously voted to rename this park. From today on, it will be known as Sanchez Hope Park, in honor of the family that taught us the true meaning of community. The ovation that followed was deafening. Elena and Carlos embraced, tears freely streaming down their faces. Amber, still holding Sophia, joined in the applause enthusiastically. When the noise finally subsided, the mayor offered Mateo the microphone. Would you like to say a few words? Mateo looked nervously at the crowd, then at his parents, who encouraged him with a smile. Taking a deep breath, he accepted the microphone. I'm not a hero, he began, faltering. I just did what I thought was right. But I've learned that sometimes doing the right thing can be hard. It can be scary, but it can also change things in ways we never imagined. He paused, searching for the right words. And when I saved Sophia, I wasn't thinking about politics or changing the community. I just knew someone needed help. And I think that's something we can all do. We don't have to save babies from hot cars every day. Sometimes helping can be as simple as smiling at a stranger, standing up for someone being treated unfairly, or just being there for a friend who needs it. Mateo looked directly at the audience, his voice gaining strength. My dad always says we're stronger together, and I think Millbrook has shown that's true. So thank you, not for honoring me or my family, but for showing that when we come together, when we care for each other no matter where we come from, we can do amazing things. The silence that followed Mateo's words was deep, filled with emotion. Then, like a wave, the applause began, growing into a roar of approval and affirmation. As Mateo stepped off the stage, he was immediately enveloped in a group hug by his family: Amber, Sophia, Dr. Thompson, and Sarah. Tears mixed with laughter, the joy of the moment tempered by the understanding of the long road they had traveled. As the afternoon wore on and the celebration continued, Mateo found himself sitting on a bench in the park, watching the community he had helped transform. Dr. Thompson joined him, offering him a glass of lemonade. You know, Mateo, the doctor said after a moment of contemplative silence, in medicine we often talk about healing, but what you've done here, what we've all done together, goes beyond healing. You've helped create something new and beautiful out of something that could have been tragic. Mateo nodded, thoughtful. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been at the park that day, if I hadn't heard Sophia. Dr. Thompson smiled. That's the power of an act of kindness, Mateo. We never really know how far its impact will reach. It's like throwing a stone into a pond. The ripples keep spreading long after the stone has disappeared beneath the surface. As the sun began to set, tinting the sky with warm hues, Mateo reflected on the doctor's words. His simple decision to help had set off a chain of events that had changed not only his life, but the lives of an entire community. And as he watched Sophia laugh in Amber's arms, his parents chatting animatedly with neighbors who had once viewed them with suspicion, former rivals sharing food and laughter, Mateo understood a profound truth. The true power of change doesn't lie in grand gestures or heroic actions. but in the small acts of kindness and compassion that each of us can perform every day. The echo of his act of kindness would continue to resonate, inspiring others to open their hearts and reach out to those in need. And in that echo, in those ripples that kept spreading, Mateo saw the true meaning of heroism and the promise of a brighter, more united future for everyone.